The morning mist clung to the Mississippi pine barrens like a funeral shroud, broken only by the acrid smell of wet ash and something far more unsettling. A lone rider crested the hill, overlooking what had once been Red Briar Plantation, and what he saw would haunt him until his dying breath. The grand manor house, with its proud white columns and imported ironwork, had been reduced to a skeleton of blackened timber and collapsed stone. Smoke still curled from the ruins, 3 days after the screaming had finally stopped. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. No wailing from the quarters, no sounds of life anywhere on the vast estate, just the distant call of carrion birds and the whisper of wind through charred magnolia branches. When Sheriff Jedediah Crockett arrived with his men that afternoon, the story wrote itself in their minds before they even dismounted. 40 enslaved souls had risen in coordinated rebellion during a harvest feast, trapping and slaughtering their masters and guests in an inferno of vengeance. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. The Black Gum Clarion would scream the tale across its front page within days, cementing the number 40 in the public imagination, turning Red Briar into a cautionary legend that would spread like wildfire through the antebellum South. But from the very beginning, the pieces didn't fit. Deep in the Mississippi hinterlands, where the soil runs red with iron and clay, Red Briar Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of unforgiving terrain. This was not the romantic South of novels and paintings, but a harsh wilderness where pine barrens stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to swallow hope itself. The nearest settlement lay 20 miles through roads that turned to impassable mire, with the first heavy rain creating an isolation so complete it felt like exile from the civilized world. The landscape itself seemed designed for secrets and suffering. Ancient cypress swamps bordered the property to the east, their black water concealing depths that had never known sunlight. To the west, rolling hills covered in second-growth pine created a maze of shadows where a man could disappear without trace. The plantation sat in a natural depression, invisible from any main thoroughfare, accessible only by a single winding road that snaked through dense forest for miles before revealing the cleared fields and outbuildings. Elias Pritchard, the Methodist circuit preacher, who would later obsess over this story, sketched a detailed map of the estate during his investigation. What emerged from his careful measurements was not merely a plantation, but a fortress designed by paranoia. The main house sat atop a small rise, commanding views of every approach while remaining hidden from distant observation. Its windows had been recently fitted with ornate but unmistakably functional iron bars, their scrollwork beautiful but their purpose unmistakable. Heavy locks secured every entrance, their brass gleaming with the newness of recent installation. A covered walkway connected the house to the kitchen building, ensuring the family need never venture into open air. Even the well had been enclosed within a stone structure topped with an iron grate, as if Silas Lament feared contamination might seep up from the very earth itself. The quarters stretched in neat, oppressive rows below the main house, each cabin built to house 6 souls in space meant for 2. The structures were solidly built, but deliberately uncomfortable, with low ceilings, small windows, and doors that could be barred from the outside. Between the big house and the slave dwellings ran a symbolic moat of manicured lawn, crossed by a single gravel path that seemed to emphasize the vast social distance more than the mere 100 yards of physical space. Pritchard noted in his folios that the estate felt less like a home than a prison, with the bars serving to keep something in rather than keep intruders out. The red clay roads that connected Red Briar to the outside world had been deliberately kept narrow, suitable only for single carriages traveling slowly. During Mississippi's frequent autumn storms, these pathways became rivers of mud, cutting the plantation off entirely from help or interference. The pine forest pressed close on all sides, its dense undergrowth creating walls of shadow even at midday. Visitors described feeling watched as they approached, though no human eyes were visible among the trees. The forest seemed to whisper with voices that spoke of old sins and unpaid debts, of blood that had soaked into soil and spirits that refused to rest. In his notes, Pritchard wrote that approaching Red Briar felt like descending into a throat that might swallow visitors whole. This was not just a home or even a business. It was a sealed environment, primed for a terrible experiment in human control and the consequences of absolute power. Silas Lement ruled Red Briar with the methodical precision of a man who trusted nothing to chance and no one to good intentions. Standing barely 5.5 feet tall, with prematurely gray hair and fingers permanently stained with ink from his obsessive record-keeping, he moved through his domain like a spider, checking the threads of an enormous web. Every enslaved person, every acre, every bushel of cotton existed not as flesh and soil and fiber, but as entries in his leather-bound ledgers, reduced to monetary values and calculated returns on investment. His obsession with control manifested in countless small tyrannies that revealed the depths of his paranoia. He required detailed reports on every conversation overheard in the quarters, every glance exchanged between slaves, every deviation from established routines. His ledgers contained not just financial records, but behavioral assessments, noting which individuals showed signs of intelligence that might prove dangerous, which displayed the proper deference, and which bore watching for signs of rebellion. His wife Cora existed as a pale ghost in their grand house, drifting between rooms in silk dresses that rustled like autumn leaves. She had borne Silas 3 children, all sent away to schools and military academies, leaving her alone with her laudanum drops and the constant tick of the massive grandfather clock that dominated their front hall. The clock, imported from London at enormous expense, chimed every quarter hour with a sound that seemed to mark the slow passage of lives wasted in service to her husband's ambitions. Servants whispered that she spoke more to the portraits of dead laments than to the living, carrying on conversations with painted eyes that never blinked or judged her increasing dependence on the brown bottles her husband kept locked in his study. The portraits themselves told the story of a family line grown thin and weak through generations of inbreeding and isolation. Pale faces with hollow eyes stared down from gilded frames, their expressions suggesting they had taken terrible secrets with them to their graves. But it was among the enslaved community that Red Briar's true character revealed itself. Isaiah, the head butler, possessed an unnerving calm that made even Silas uncomfortable. Tall and lean, with graying temples and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of every conversation, Isaiah moved through the house with the silence of a hunting cat. He could read and write, skills that should have cost him his life, but which Silas tolerated because they made Isaiah more valuable as an overseer of the other house servants. Isaiah's literacy was not the result of kindness or oversight, but of calculated necessity. Silas needed someone who could manage the complex correspondence required to maintain his web of business relationships and political connections. The butler served as his unofficial secretary, privy to information that could destroy reputations and end careers. This knowledge made Isaiah simultaneously invaluable and incredibly dangerous, a contradiction that Silas never fully recognized. Whispering Mary, ancient beyond counting, served as the plantation's unofficial historian and herbalist. The other enslaved people brought her their ailments and their secrets, seeking remedies from her vast knowledge of roots and leaves. She claimed to have been born in Africa, though no one living could verify such a distant past. Her gnarled hands could prepare medicines that eased pain or poisons that stopped hearts, knowledge that made her invaluable and deeply feared in equal measure. Mary's influence extended far beyond her medical skills. She served as the keeper of oral traditions, the repository of stories that connected the enslaved community to ancestors and homelands that slavery had tried to erase. In her voice lived the memories of kingdoms and families, of languages and customs that predated the ships that had brought her people to this alien shore. She spoke of justice that transcended human law, of debts that accumulated across generations, of powers that waited patiently for the moment when accounts would finally be balanced. The field hands looked to Joshua, a man whose massive frame concealed a mind sharp as any blade. Born on Red Briar, he knew every path through the surrounding swamps, every hiding place in the dense forests, every current and sandbar in the twisting waterways. His knowledge made him invaluable for tracking runaway slaves, but it also made him the perfect guide for those seeking to vanish into the wilderness. Young Martha served in the dining room, her silent efficiency masking an intelligence that cataloged every conversation, every revelation that passed between the white family and their guests. She had been separated from her own children, sold to distant plantations when they showed signs of inherited cleverness that Silas deemed dangerous. The loss had transformed her into something harder and more focused than grief alone could explain. In his ledgers, Silas recorded 43 enslaved individuals by name, age, skills, and current market value. But he never recorded their relationships to each other, their hopes, their quiet acts of resistance, or the way they watched him with eyes that measured and calculated just as carefully as his own. He failed to document the network of communication that connected the quarters to the fields, to the main house, a system of signals and messages that operated entirely beneath his notice. Most critically, he never recognized that his own obsession with documentation had created the very intelligence network that would ultimately destroy him. Every letter he dictated to Isaiah, every conversation he held within earshot of servants, every plan he committed to paper became part of a growing body of knowledge that his enemies were patiently assembling against him. Beneath the surface of enforced order, a different kind of intelligence was at work, patient and methodical and utterly invisible to the man who believed he owned their very souls. A year before the night that would make Red Briar infamous, a 12-year-old boy named Samuel discovered that knowledge could be more dangerous than rebellion. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the quarters, he had secreted away a primer abandoned by one of the lament children, teaching himself letters by candlelight when the overseer slept. Reading came to him like breathing, natural and necessary, and soon he was helping others decode the mysterious marks that held such power in the white world. Samuel's hunger for learning went beyond mere curiosity. He understood instinctively that literacy represented a form of freedom that existed independent of physical chains, a way of seeing the world that could not be controlled by masters or overseers. In the stolen hours before dawn, he practiced forming letters in the dirt floor of his cabin. Erasing the evidence before the morning bell summoned the field hands to their labor. The boy's intelligence could not be hidden forever. He began asking questions that revealed an understanding of the larger world beyond Red Briar, questions about the war that was beginning to tear the country apart, about the political movements that threatened the institution of slavery itself. His curiosity extended to the business of the plantation, the networks of buyers and sellers that sustained Silas Lament's wealth, the connections between Red Briar and the wider economy of human bondage. When Silas discovered the boy's literacy during a surprise inspection, his rage transformed into something colder and more calculated than mere anger. The primer was found during a search that had been triggered by reports of unusual activity in the quarters, whispered conversations that stopped when white faces appeared, a sense that information was flowing through channels that existed outside his control. Rather than the expected beating or sale, Silas sentenced Samuel to retrieve a runaway hog from the deepest part of Blackwater Creek, where the current ran swift and treacherous over hidden snags. The punishment was presented as a test of the boy's obedience and courage, a chance to redeem himself through dangerous but necessary service to the plantation. The other enslaved people understood the true nature of the task immediately. It was an execution disguised as an accident. The boy could swim well enough, but the October water was shockingly cold, and the hog, panicked and massive, fought him with desperate strength. The animal's weight and the swift current combined to create a trap from which escape was nearly impossible. Samuel fought valiantly, but the icy water sapped his strength while the terrified hog's struggles pulled him deeper into the treacherous channel. They found Samuel's body 3 days later, tangled in cypress roots a mile downstream, the primer still clutched in his stiffening fingers. The book had been reduced to a sodden mass of illegible pages, but its presence told a story more powerful than any words it might have contained. Even in death, the boy had refused to release his hold on the knowledge that had cost him his life. Silas declared it a tragic accident, the cost of a careless boy's disobedience, and ordered the matter closed. But the enslaved community understood the message perfectly. Samuel had died not for running away or stealing, but for the crime of learning to read the world around him, for daring to imagine that his mind might be capable of understanding truths that were supposedly beyond his reach. Isaiah retrieved the body himself, wading into the brown water with a calm that unsettled even the hardened field hands. As he carried Samuel's small form to shore, something fundamental shifted in his demeanor. The other servants noticed it immediately, the way his silence deepened, how his eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if he was calculating possibilities that existed beyond the present moment. The head butler's transformation was subtle but unmistakable. He began moving through the plantation with a different kind of purpose, his conversations with other house servants taking on an urgency that had not existed before. He started paying attention to details that had previously seemed unimportant: the timing of deliveries, the patterns of visitors, the rhythms of white society that governed life at Red Briar. That night, Whispering Mary gathered the community in the quarters and spoke words that sounded like prayers but felt like prophecy. She sprinkled herbs around Samuel's body and muttered in the old language about debts that would be paid and accounts that must be balanced. Some claimed she placed a curse on the main house itself, calling down the ancestors to witness the injustice and demanding retribution from powers older than slavery. Her ritual connected Samuel's death to larger forces of justice and retribution that transcended the immediate circumstances of plantation life. She spoke of the boy as a martyr, whose sacrifice would not be forgotten, whose blood had awakened spirits that would demand satisfaction for the crimes committed against the innocent. The ceremony transformed a personal tragedy into a collective call for action, a moment when the enslaved community recognized that their survival depended on their willingness to act against their oppressors. The memory festered like an untreated wound, growing more poisonous with each passing season, waiting for the moment when old debts would finally come due. By autumn of 1861, the war had begun to cast long shadows across the South, and Silas Lement felt the foundations of his carefully ordered world shifting beneath his feet. Cotton prices fluctuated wildly as Union blockades disrupted traditional trading patterns, and the Confederate currency that replaced federal money seemed to lose value with each passing week. Trade routes that had operated reliably for decades had become unreliable or disappeared entirely. forcing planters to seek new markets and new sources of credit. Worst of all, whispers of slave insurrections seemed to multiply with each passing week, fed by reports from other plantations where masters had awakened to find their human property vanished into the night. The war had created opportunities for escape that had never existed before, and the enslaved population throughout the South was beginning to test the boundaries of a system that suddenly seemed less permanent than it had appeared. Determined to project strength and normalcy in the face of growing uncertainty, Silas conceived a plan to host the most elaborate harvest feast Red Briar had ever seen. The event would serve multiple purposes, demonstrating his continued prosperity to potential creditors, reinforcing his social connections with local political leaders, and providing opportunities to gather intelligence about Confederate military plans that might affect his business interests. The invitations, engraved on expensive cream paper and sealed with burgundy wax, went out to the cream of Blackgum County society. Each invitation was carefully crafted to appeal to specific interests and concerns, promising not just hospitality but access to information and opportunities that might prove valuable in the uncertain times ahead. Sheriff Jedediah Crockett received his invitation with a mixture of pleasure and obligation, knowing that Silas's political connections made acceptance more command than request. The sheriff owed his position to the influence of men like Lament, and he understood that such debts required periodic acknowledgement through social participation and public support. Captain Alistair Vance, visiting the county on Confederate quartermaster business, found himself added to the guest list as both honored visitor and potential source of valuable war intelligence. His presence would lend military gravitas to the evening, while providing Silas with opportunities to learn about troop movements, supply requirements, and strategic plans that might affect his cotton trading operations. The banker Hadley and his wife were invited because their financial institution held mortgages on several properties in the region, including some of Silas's own holdings. Their attendance would demonstrate his continued creditworthiness, while providing opportunities to negotiate more favorable terms for his existing debts and potential future borrowing. Most intriguingly, Silas extended a special invitation to the Reverend Absalom Fry, a traveling fire and brimstone preacher whose sermons could reduce grown men to weeping penitents. Fry's reputation extended throughout the region, and his presence would lend spiritual gravitas to the evening while providing the kind of moral authority that Silas believed might help him navigate the increasingly treacherous waters of wartime politics. The Reverend's sermons typically focused on themes of divine judgment and righteous punishment for those who defied God's natural order. His presence at Red Briar would serve as both entertainment and implicit warning to anyone who might question the legitimacy of slavery or challenge the authority of those who profited from it. The preparations began weeks in advance, transforming Red Briar into a stage for Silas's performance of unshakable confidence. Every surface in the main house received fresh polish, every silver piece gleamed like mirrors, and the finest china emerged from storage to grace tables that would groan under the weight of Southern hospitality. The enslaved community found themselves working 18-hour days, preparing delicacies that few of them would ever taste, creating abundance from their own deprivation. The menu itself was designed to impress, featuring dishes that required ingredients imported at considerable expense from distant cities. Oysters from the Gulf Coast, wine from France, spices from the Caribbean, all transported through blockade runners and black market traders who charged premium prices for their dangerous services. The cost of the feast represented a significant investment, but Silas understood that appearance often mattered more than reality in maintaining the confidence of creditors and political allies. But Captain Vance's letter to his wife, written just days before the feast, revealed disturbing undercurrents beneath the festive preparations. He complained of a bilious fever that seemed to affect several guests during their preliminary visits, describing symptoms that left him weak and nauseous for days. The captain attributed his illness to the oppressive atmosphere of the plantation itself, writing that Red Briar felt like a place where the very air had turned unwholesome. His description of the plantation's atmosphere was remarkably detailed, noting the way shadows seemed to linger longer than natural, the unusual silence that fell over the property during certain hours, and the strange behavior of animals that refused to venture near the main house after dark. He wrote of sensing unseen eyes watching him from windows and doorways, of conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered rooms, of a general feeling that he was not welcome despite the elaborate hospitality being prepared in his honor. As November 1st approached, carriages began arriving through the pine forests, bringing guests who had no idea they were entering a trap that had been months in the making. The stage was set, the players assembled, and unknown to anyone except Isaiah and his conspirators, the doors were about to be locked from the inside. What happened on the evening of November 1st, 1861, was not the spontaneous eruption of violence that history would record, but rather the culmination of months of patient planning executed with clockwork precision. Isaiah had spent the better part of a year studying the routines of Red Briar's inhabitants, mapping their movements, memorizing their habits, and above all, learning the intricate system of locks and keys that Silas had installed in his paranoid quest for security. The head butler's preparation extended far beyond simple observation. He had carefully cultivated relationships with every member of the enslaved community, identifying those who could be trusted with dangerous knowledge and those who might serve as unwitting participants in the larger plan. His network extended beyond the boundaries of Red Briar itself, reaching into the surrounding plantations through the informal communication system that connected enslaved communities across the region. The evening began like any other elaborate Southern social gathering, with guests arriving in their finest clothes, servants gliding silently between rooms with crystal glasses of imported spirits, and the low murmur of polite conversation, mixing with the clink of silverware against bone china. But beneath the veneer of hospitality, Isaiah's network was already in motion, each participant playing their assigned role with the discipline of seasoned actors. Martha, who served in the dining room, carried more than just serving trays as she moved between the kitchen and the main house. Hidden beneath her starched apron, she transported the heavy iron keys that would soon transform Red Briar from fortress to prison. Each key had been carefully cataloged and tested, ensuring that every lock could be secured at the predetermined moment. Young Thomas, barely 16 but trusted to tend the fires throughout the house, used his access to every room to position himself at crucial doorways, ready to turn locks at predetermined signals. The genius of Isaiah's plan lay not in violence, but in the manipulation of the very security measures that Silas had designed to protect himself. Every new lock, every iron bar, every reinforced door that the master had installed in his fear would now serve the rebels' purposes. The paranoid fortifications that were meant to keep danger out would instead keep it trapped within, turning the manor house into a sealed chamber from which escape would be impossible. Subscribe, because this story about to unfold goes beyond anything you could imagine in your darkest nightmares. As the evening progressed and the guests became increasingly absorbed in their revelry, the servants began the delicate process of sealing the manor house room by room. The operation required precise timing and flawless coordination, as any mistake could expose the entire conspiracy and result in the torture and execution of everyone involved. The signals were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to read them. A particular way of placing a candlestick indicated that a specific section of the house had been secured. The arrangement of flowers on a table communicated the status of exterior doors and windows. The timing of when certain dishes appeared told the conspirators whether guests had noticed anything unusual about the evening service. To the untrained eye, these were merely the normal choreography of formal service, the kind of precise ritual that characterized elite Southern hospitality. But to Isaiah's conspirators, they represented a countdown to the moment when Red Briar would become a trap from which there could be no escape. Every gesture carried meaning. Every movement served the larger purpose of the plan that was unfolding around the unsuspecting guests. The enslaved community's knowledge of the house proved invaluable in executing their strategy. They knew which floorboards creaked, which doors could be secured silently, which rooms offered the best acoustics for monitoring conversations. This intimate familiarity with the physical environment gave them advantages that their oppressors had never considered, turning their forced familiarity with every detail of the plantation into a weapon that could be used against their masters. By 8 o'clock, as the guests settled into the drawing room for pre-dinner drinks, the exterior doors had been systematically secured. By 9 o'clock, as they moved to the dining room for the first course, the windows on the ground floor had been barred from the inside. The guests, absorbed in their conversations about war and politics and business, failed to notice the gradual transformation of their host's home into their tomb. The dinner itself proceeded with elaborate formality, each course served with the kind of precision that demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the Lament household. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, touching on subjects that revealed the guests' assumptions about their own security and the permanence of the social order that sustained their privileges. As Reverend Fry prepared to deliver an impromptu sermon on the righteous order of Southern society, every exterior door in the manor house had been quietly locked and barred from the inside. The machine was now fully operational, its gears turning with the inevitability of fate itself, and there would be no escape from the justice that was about to unfold. 6 months after the flames died at Red Briar, Elias Pritchard tracked down the one man who might hold the key to understanding what really happened that November night. The journey led him deep into the Pascagoula River swamps, where displaced souls sought refuge in a landscape that offered concealment to those with nowhere else to run. The swamplands themselves seemed designed for secrecy, with their maze of waterways and islands, their dense canopies that blocked out sunlight, and their reputation for swallowing those who entered without proper knowledge of their hidden dangers. In a ramshackle cabin built on stilts above the brackish water, he found Ezekiel, a field hand who had fled Red Briar the morning of the feast. The structure itself testified to the precarious existence of those who sought refuge in the wilderness, its walls patched with whatever materials could be salvaged, its roof a patchwork of boards and canvas that provided questionable protection from the elements. Ezekiel's appearance shocked Pritchard, who had expected to find a man broken by his experiences, but instead encountered someone who seemed to have been transformed by them. The former field hand carried himself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than defeat, though his eyes held shadows that suggested he had witnessed things that would haunt him forever. The man's hands trembled as he poured weak coffee from a dented pot, his eyes constantly darting toward the single window, as if expecting pursuers to emerge from the Spanish moss at any moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about power and justice in the world of slavery. The story that emerged from their conversation revealed layers of complexity that had never appeared in Sheriff Crockett's official reports or the sensationalized newspaper accounts that had shaped public understanding of the Red Briar incident. Ezekiel spoke of plans within plans, of information that had been carefully gathered and analyzed, of a community that had demonstrated strategic thinking that contradicted every stereotype about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people. According to Ezekiel's account, Isaiah had approached him 3 days before the feast with instructions that seemed cryptic at the time, but would prove prophetic in their precision. The head butler had spoken of a second act, a contingency plan that would only be implemented if certain conditions were met. He told Ezekiel that when the big house bell tolled midnight, every field hand should run for the swamps without looking back, carrying only what they could hide beneath their clothes. The instructions were accompanied by detailed information about safe routes through the surrounding wilderness, locations where supplies had been cached for those who might need to survive in the swamps for extended periods, and contacts among free people of color in distant communities who might provide assistance to refugees. The level of preparation suggested months or even years of advanced planning, a network of support that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single plantation. Most disturbing of all was Ezekiel's description of Whispering Mary's activities in the days leading up to the feast. The old woman had been brewing what she called strong teas, gathering roots and berries from deep in the forest, and preparing tinctures with an intensity that suggested something far more serious than her usual healing work. She spoke to Ezekiel of debts that were finally coming due, and of justice that would arrive wearing the mask of tragedy. Mary's preparations extended beyond her herbal work to include rituals that connected the planned action to spiritual traditions that predated slavery itself. She spoke of ancestors who demanded satisfaction for crimes committed against their descendants, of powers that would guide the hands of those who sought justice for the innocent. Her work provided the enslaved community with a sense of moral authority that transformed their planned resistance from simple rebellion into sacred duty. Ezekiel's testimony revealed that the rebellion was not the spontaneous uprising that Sheriff Crockett had described in his official reports, but rather a carefully orchestrated response to events that were already set in motion. Isaiah had somehow learned of a plan that threatened not just his life, but the lives of every person on the plantation, and he had prepared accordingly. The field hand's knowledge of the conspiracy extended to details that suggested the enslaved community had access to information that their masters never suspected they possessed. They knew about business relationships that connected Red Briar to other plantations and commercial enterprises. They understood the political pressures that were shaping their masters' decisions about the future. Most importantly, they had learned about specific threats that were driving their oppressors to increasingly desperate measures. As rain drummed against the tin roof of the swamp shack and Pritchard scribbled notes by flickering candlelight, Ezekiel delivered the most chilling revelation of all. The fire that consumed Red Briar was not the main event, he insisted, but merely the finale to a performance that had begun hours earlier when the guests sat down to their last meal. The real drama had unfolded in conversations and confrontations that the outside world would never know about, in revelations that had exposed the true nature of the evil that had flourished under the guise of Southern hospitality. Sheriff Jedediah Crockett arrived at Red Briar with 6 deputies and a mindset already shaped by the sensational reports that had reached town ahead of him. The scene that greeted them seemed to confirm every prejudice and fear about slave insurrections that had haunted the Southern imagination for generations. The manor house stood as a blackened shell, its roof collapsed, its windows blown out by the heat, and the acrid smell of burned flesh hanging in the still November air like a judgment from an angry god. The sheriff's approach to the investigation revealed more about his assumptions than his professional competence. He had arrived expecting to find evidence of savage violence committed by enslaved rebels against their innocent masters, and he interpreted everything he saw through that predetermined lens. The possibility that the evidence might tell a different story never seriously occurred to him, partly because such an interpretation would have challenged fundamental beliefs about race and social order that formed the foundation of his worldview. Crockett ordered his men to kick in the charred remains of the front door, though the action was largely symbolic since the fire had already created multiple entrances through walls and windows. The sound of splintering wood seemed to announce their intention to impose their version of justice on whatever they might discover within the ruins. Inside, they found a scene of devastation that supported the narrative of coordinated violence followed by arson. Overturned furniture, shattered china, and what appeared to be the remains of at least 8 individuals scattered throughout the ground floor rooms created a tableau that seemed to confirm the worst fears about slave rebellion. The deputies moved through the ruins with the confidence of men who understood exactly what had happened and needed only to document evidence that supported their preconceived conclusions. The sheriff's investigation, if it could be called that, took less than 4 hours. He interviewed the surviving field hands who had remained in the quarters, all of whom claimed to have been asleep during the critical hours and to have awakened only when the flames began spreading to nearby outbuildings. Their stories were consistent but vague, a uniformity that Crockett interpreted as evidence of conspiracy rather than truth. The interrogations were conducted with the kind of intimidation that was designed to produce confirmation rather than information. Crockett and his deputies made it clear that they expected specific answers to their questions, and that deviation from the expected narrative would be treated as evidence of complicity in the alleged crimes. The field hands, understanding the dangerous position they occupied, provided responses that satisfied their questioners while revealing nothing of substance about what had actually occurred. Most significantly, none of the house servants could be found. Isaiah had vanished along with Martha, Thomas, and 6 others who had been working inside the manor during the feast. Their absence struck Crockett as proof positive of their guilt, reinforcing his conviction that he was dealing with a premeditated massacre rather than a tragic accident or external attack. The sheriff's logic was brutally simple. The house servants had been present during the evening. They had access to the interior of the manor, and they had disappeared immediately after the fire. In his mind, these facts constituted irrefutable proof of their responsibility for the deaths of their masters and guests. The possibility that they might have fled to avoid being blamed for crimes they had not committed never occurred to him. In his official ledger, Sheriff Crockett recorded the incident with bureaucratic precision that revealed more about his assumptions than his investigative skills. Loss of property, human and material, by fire and riot, he wrote, listing the estimated monetary value of the destroyed slaves at $12,000 and the structural damage at another $8,000. The human cost of the evening was reduced to columns of figures, debits in the grand ledger of Southern economic life. The sheriff's report became the foundation for all subsequent understanding of the Red Briar incident, despite its obvious gaps and logical inconsistencies. He made no attempt to explain how the house servants had managed to coordinate their actions so effectively, how they had overcome armed guests who should have been able to defend themselves, or why they had chosen this particular evening for their rebellion. Any evidence that might have complicated this tidy narrative was either overlooked or deliberately ignored. The heavy iron bars that should have made escape impossible for the trapped guests went unmentioned in the official report. The fact that several bodies showed signs of illness prior to the fire was dismissed as irrelevant. Most telling of all, no investigation was made into the guests' reasons for being at Red Briar or their relationships with their host. The absence of any surviving witnesses from among the house servants meant that Crockett's version of events faced no contradiction from those who might have provided alternative explanations. The dead could not speak, and the living had either fled or been intimidated into silence. This convenient absence of contradictory testimony allowed the sheriff to construct a narrative that served the political and social needs of the white community while avoiding uncomfortable questions about the behavior of the victims. The official story was written in ash and blood, but it was written too quickly by men who needed simple answers to complicated questions. 3 weeks after the fire, Pritchard gained access to Silas Lament's personal records through the intervention of a distant cousin who served as the estate's executor. The ledgers had survived the conflagration because they were kept in a fireproof safe that Silas had installed in his study, a precaution that would ultimately provide the key to understanding the true nature of the events at Red Briar. What the circuit preacher discovered in those meticulously kept records challenged every assumption about the incident and suggested a conspiracy far more complex than a simple slave rebellion. The ledgers themselves were works of obsessive documentation, filled with entries that revealed the depth of Silas's paranoia and his compulsive need to control every aspect of life on his plantation. Every expenditure was recorded, every transaction documented, every relationship with neighbors and business associates carefully tracked. The books provided a window into the mind of a man who trusted no one and suspected everyone of plotting against him. The first anomaly appeared in the accounts for October of 1861, where Pritchard found an extraordinary expenditure for imported French wine. Silas, a lifelong temperance advocate who regarded alcohol as the devil's snare and regularly delivered lectures on its corrupting influence, had purchased 12 bottles of Chateau Margaux at the staggering cost of $30 per bottle. The wine had been ordered specifically for the harvest feast, a curious indulgence for a man who typically served only sweet tea and buttermilk to his guests. The purchase was particularly puzzling because it was accompanied by detailed instructions for the wine's storage and serving, specifications that demonstrated knowledge of vintages and proper handling that seemed inconsistent with Silas's supposed abstinence. The invoices included recommendations for specific glassware and serving temperatures, suggesting that considerable research had gone into selecting the right wine for the evening's purpose. Even more intriguing were the extensive payments to ironmongers and locksmiths throughout the summer and early autumn. Silas had spent nearly $400 reinforcing the manor house with bars, locks, and reinforced doors, transforming his home into what one invoice described as a secure residential fortress. The timing of these improvements coincided precisely with Captain Vance's arrival in the county and the planning for the harvest feast. The invoices revealed that the security improvements had been designed with specific scenarios in mind. The bars on the windows were installed on both the interior and exterior sides, creating a double barrier that would be equally effective at keeping people in or out. The locks on the doors were of a type normally used in prisons, designed to be operated only from one side and built to withstand attempts at forced entry from within. Pritchard's most disturbing discovery came in the form of correspondence tucked between the pages of the household accounts. A letter from Captain Vance, dated October 28th, complained bitterly about a mysterious illness that had struck him during his preliminary visit to Red Briar. He described symptoms that included severe nausea, weakness, and a metallic taste that lingered for days after his departure. The captain attributed his condition to bad water or spoiled food, but the timing suggested something more sinister. The letter was particularly revealing because it mentioned similar symptoms affecting other guests who had visited Red Briar during the weeks leading up to the feast. Banker Hadley had complained of digestive troubles following a business meeting at the plantation. The Reverend Fry had written to express concerns about his health after delivering a practice sermon in the plantation's chapel. The pattern suggested that someone had been systematically testing methods and dosages in preparation for a larger operation. Cross-referencing the wine purchase with the guest list for the feast, Pritchard realized that Silas had ordered exactly enough bottles to serve each invited guest multiple glasses throughout the evening. The wine was not meant for the Lament family, who abstained from alcohol, but specifically for visitors who would have no reason to question the quality or source of such an expensive vintage. Further investigation revealed that Silas had also purchased unusual quantities of other items that seemed unrelated to normal plantation operations. Large amounts of lamp oil, far more than would be needed for routine lighting, had been ordered and stored in the manor house. Expensive imported candles had been purchased in quantities that suggested they were intended for a specific event rather than ongoing use. Most mysteriously, the ledgers recorded payments to a Charleston apothecary for substances that were not identified by name, but were listed only as special preparations, with prices that suggested exotic or dangerous materials. The dates of these purchases coincided with the mysterious illnesses that had affected preliminary visitors to Red Briar, suggesting a connection between the experiments and the planned feast. A pattern began to emerge from the scattered entries and receipts, suggesting that the harvest feast had been planned not as a celebration, but as something far more calculating and deadly. The rebellion, it seemed, had not been directed against innocent victims enjoying Southern hospitality, but against people who were themselves engaged in a plot of extraordinary malice. The ledger's final entries revealed the scope of Silas's desperation. His cotton crop had failed due to an early blight. His debts to Northern creditors had reached unsustainable levels, and Confederate currency had lost so much value that his liquid assets were nearly worthless. The plantation was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Silas faced the prospect of losing everything his family had built over generations. The final entry, made in Silas's careful handwriting on the morning of November 1st, read simply, "All accounts to be settled this evening." Below it, in what appeared to be a different hand entirely, someone had added a single word, "Indeed." The second notation was written in the kind of educated script that suggested literacy unusual among the enslaved population, pointing to Isaiah as the probable author of this ominous commentary. As November first deepened into its final hours, the carefully maintained facade of Southern hospitality at Red Briar began to crumble, revealing the deadly game that had been set in motion weeks before. The imported wine flowed freely among the guests, its rich burgundy color concealing the bitter almond extract that Whispering Mary had introduced through her careful manipulation of the servants responsible for decanting and serving. The poison had been prepared with the kind of precision that demonstrated extensive knowledge of chemistry and human physiology. Mary's understanding of toxic plants extended far beyond the folk remedies that white society expected from enslaved herbalists. She possessed knowledge that had been passed down through generations, refined through necessity and desperation, perfected by people who had learned to protect themselves using whatever weapons nature provided. Captain Vance was the first to succumb, collapsing during Reverend Fry's impromptu sermon about the divine order that justified human bondage. The captain's face turned ashen, his breathing became labored, and within minutes he was convulsing on the drawing room floor, while the other guests looked on in horrified confusion. The symptoms were unmistakable to anyone familiar with plant-based toxins: rapid onset of respiratory distress followed by cardiovascular collapse. Mrs. Hadley, the banker's wife, began experiencing similar symptoms shortly afterward, clutching her throat and gasping for air that would not come. Her husband attempted to assist her, but his own consumption of the tainted wine soon left him struggling with his own survival. The poison worked with methodical efficiency, attacking the nervous system while causing excruciating pain that left its victims unable to call for help or coordinate any defense. Panic erupted as the remaining guests realized they were trapped in a house that had become their tomb. The carefully installed locks and bars that Silas had presented as security measures now revealed their true purpose, preventing escape while the poison completed its methodical work. The guests threw themselves against doors that would not budge, clawed at windows that were sealed behind iron bars, screamed for help that would never come. The Reverend Fry, still partially coherent despite his consumption of the poisoned wine, began screaming about divine judgment and the wages of sin, his fire and brimstone rhetoric taking on a terrifying immediacy. His sermons about righteous punishment for the wicked suddenly seemed prophetic, as if he had unconsciously predicted his own fate while preaching about the justice that awaited those who oppressed the innocent. It was then that Isaiah appeared in the doorway of the drawing room, his face illuminated by flickering candlelight, his expression calm as death itself. In his hands he carried a leather portfolio that the surviving witnesses would later recognize as containing documents that revealed the true purpose of the evening's gathering. His presence transformed the chaotic scene into something resembling a courtroom, with himself as both judge and prosecutor. Silas, cornered and desperate as he watched his carefully laid plans collapse around him, confronted his head butler with a rage born of fear and the recognition that his own servant had somehow gained control of the situation. The master's fury was complicated by his growing realization that he too had been exposed to the poison, though in smaller doses that left him weakened but still conscious. The conversation that followed, reconstructed years later from the testimony of those who lived to speak of it, revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had brought together the guests at Red Briar. Captain Vance had not come to the plantation as a social visitor, but as a blackmailer who had discovered Silas's illegal cotton sales to northern textile mills, transactions that constituted treason against the Confederacy and would have resulted in execution if exposed. The other guests were not friends celebrating the harvest, but accomplices and co-conspirators in a scheme that was breathtaking in its cynicism and cruelty. They had come to Red Briar to participate in the murder of Captain Vance, whose knowledge of their illegal activities threatened to destroy them all. The plan had been to poison the captain while framing the enslaved population for his death, creating a narrative of slave rebellion that would divert attention from their own crimes. But the scheme extended far beyond simple murder. The conspirators had planned to use the captain's death as justification for a campaign of terror against the enslaved population throughout the region, massacring innocent people to cover their tracks while seizing their property under the pretext of emergency wartime measures. The harvest feast was intended to be the opening act of a drama that would have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of enslaved people across multiple plantations. Isaiah's calm voice cut through the chaos as he explained how the enslaved community had discovered the plot through their invisible network of information gathering. They had learned that the guests were already marked for death by their host's poison, and they had simply chosen to let justice take its course while ensuring that the true perpetrators would not escape to plan further atrocities. The head butler's revelation transformed the dying guests from victims into criminals, their suffering from tragedy into justice. The poison that was killing them had been intended for Captain Vance, but Silas's greed and paranoia had led him to eliminate all potential witnesses to his crimes. The enslaved conspirators had simply allowed the white criminals to destroy each other while taking control of the narrative that would survive them. The fire that would soon consume Red Briar was not an act of revenge against the innocent, but a funeral pyre for those who had already condemned themselves through their own greed and malice. The truth about Red Briar, assembled painstakingly from fragments of evidence and whispered testimony, revealed a deception so elegant in its simplicity that it had fooled an entire region for generations. The enslaved population had not massacred their masters in a fit of murderous rage. They had merely allowed their masters to massacre each other while taking control of the narrative that would follow. Pritchard's investigation uncovered the full scope of Silas Lament's original plan, a scheme of breathtaking cynicism designed to eliminate his blackmailers while providing the perfect cover for mass murder. The expensive wine had been poisoned not by Isaiah or Whispering Mary, but by Silas himself, using arsenic and bitter almond extract to create a cocktail that would kill quickly while leaving evidence that could be attributed to slave rebellion. The plan had been simple in its brutality: poison the captain and any other witnesses to his illegal activities, murder several house servants to serve as scapegoats, then burn the manor house to destroy the evidence while claiming that the enslaved population had risen in coordinated insurrection. Sheriff Crockett, who owed his position to Silas's political influence, would have been counted upon to conduct a perfunctory investigation that supported the predetermined narrative. The scheme would have achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. It would have eliminated the blackmail threat posed by Captain Vance, destroyed evidence of treasonous cotton sales to Northern mills, provided justification for seizing enslaved property from neighboring plantations, and created a climate of fear that would strengthen Confederate control over the civilian population. But Isaiah and his conspirators had infiltrated every aspect of the plot, using their positions as invisible servants to gather intelligence about their master's intentions. Their access to private conversations, personal correspondence, and business records had given them knowledge that their oppressors never suspected they possessed. They knew about the poison, the planned murders, and the intended frame-up that would have resulted in the massacre of innocent people throughout the region. When they discovered that they were intended to be both the scapegoats and the victims of Silas's scheme, they made a decision that demonstrated strategic thinking of the highest order. Rather than attempt to prevent the poisoning or warn the intended victims, they chose to let the poison do its work, while taking control of what happened afterward. The decision was morally complex but strategically brilliant. The guests at Red Briar were not innocent victims of slave rebellion, but criminals who had planned to use the captain's death as justification for mass murder. By allowing them to consume the poison that Silas had prepared for their supposed victim, the enslaved conspirators were preventing a far greater atrocity while ensuring that the true perpetrators faced justice for their crimes. The fire that consumed Red Briar served multiple purposes in their counter-conspiracy. It destroyed the evidence of the original poisoning plot, eliminated the physical traces that might have revealed the truth about the evening's events, and created a spectacular cover story that would allow the real heroes to escape into the swamps, while the world focused on the dramatic symbol of slave rebellion. Most brilliantly of all, the enslaved conspirators had turned their masters' own racist assumptions against them. Southern society was so prepared to believe in the savage violence of slave insurrection that it never occurred to anyone to question whether the enslaved population might be capable of such sophisticated strategic thinking. The perfect revenge was not just escaping slavery, but doing so while allowing their oppressors to destroy themselves and take the blame for their own destruction. The narrative that emerged from the ashes of Red Briar served the needs of everyone except the truth. White society got confirmation of their fears about slave rebellion justifying increased oppression and surveillance. Confederate authorities got a dramatic example of Northern-inspired insurrection supporting their war propaganda. the escaped slaves got their freedom along with the satisfaction of knowing that their oppressors had been destroyed by their own evil intentions. The world saw a hell of their own making, but they were looking in the wrong direction for both the perpetrators and the victims. The real massacre at Red Briar was not committed by enslaved rebels against innocent masters, but by white criminals against each other, with the enslaved population serving as witnesses to justice rather than agents of vengeance. In the weeks following the fire at Red Briar, the story took on a life of its own, spreading through the antebellum South like a contagion of fear and racial paranoia. The Black Gum Clarion's sensationalized coverage was picked up by newspapers from New Orleans to Richmond, each retelling adding new details and amplifying the horror until the 40 enslaved rebels became a symbol of every white Southerner's deepest nightmare about the consequences of their peculiar institution. The tale evolved, with each telling acquiring elements that made it more useful for the political purposes it served. The number of victims increased, the brutality became more graphic, and the coordination of the rebellion more sophisticated. Editorial writers used Red Briar as evidence that abolition would result in widespread massacres, while Confederate recruiters pointed to it as proof that the war was necessary to prevent similar atrocities throughout the South. The story served the political purposes of Confederate propagandists, who used it to justify increasingly harsh slave codes and to rally white support for the war effort by portraying the conflict as a struggle against Northern abolitionists who would unleash similar massacres across the South. Preachers delivered sermons about Red Briar as evidence of divine punishment for insufficient vigilance, while politicians pointed to the tragedy as proof that any weakening of the slavery system would result in wholesale slaughter of the white population. The legend became particularly useful for justifying military actions that might otherwise have seemed excessive. Cavalry raids on suspected Underground Railroad stations were presented as necessary responses to the Red Briar threat. Mass arrests of free people of color were defended as preventive measures against future insurrections. The suspension of civil liberties in occupied territories was portrayed as essential for public safety in light of the demonstrated capacity for coordinated slave rebellion. Sheriff Crockett's official report became the authoritative version of events, despite its obvious gaps and inconsistencies. The fact that no bodies of enslaved rebels were ever recovered was explained away as evidence of their successful escape into the vast swamplands where pursuit would be futile. The absence of any witnesses to the actual violence was attributed to the coordinated nature of the conspiracy and the thoroughness with which the rebels had eliminated potential testimony. The sheriff himself became something of a celebrity, traveling to other counties to speak about the Red Briar investigation and advise local authorities on preventing similar incidents. His lectures emphasized the importance of constant surveillance, the danger of allowing enslaved people to gather in groups, and the necessity of swift and severe punishment for any signs of resistance. His expertise was considered so valuable that he was eventually appointed to a regional security committee with authority over multiple counties. Red Briar itself was abandoned to nature, deemed cursed by superstitious locals who claimed to hear screaming from the ruins on still November nights. The land was eventually sold for taxes to a timber company that found the soil too acidic and the local labor force too reluctant to work the property. Attempts to log the forest were plagued by equipment failures, worker accidents, and other mishaps that convinced company managers to abandon their operations. Within a decade, the forest had begun to reclaim the clearings, and the red clay roads had disappeared beneath carpets of pine needles and Virginia creeper. The ruins of the manor house became overgrown with kudzu and wild grapevines, creating a Gothic landscape that seemed to embody the horror of the legend that surrounded it. Local hunters reported that animals avoided the area, and even the birds seemed to fall silent when passing over the former plantation grounds. No enslaved person was ever formally charged with the crimes at Red Briar, partly because the alleged perpetrators had vanished completely, and partly because the legal system of the time was more concerned with the symbolic value of the story than with the practical difficulties of prosecution. Isaiah and his co-conspirators had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of American slavery. They had committed the perfect crime by allowing others to commit theirs first. The absence of trials or convictions did not diminish the power of the Red Briar legend to influence policy and public opinion throughout the remaining years of the Civil War and beyond. The story became a touchstone for discussions about race, slavery, and social order, a cautionary tale that reinforced existing prejudices while discouraging deeper examination of the systemic injustices that had created the conditions for such desperate measures. The land absorbed both the blood and the lie, leaving behind only a ghost story that would be told and retold until the truth became irretrievable beneath layers of legend and political mythology. More than a century and a half after the flames died at Red Briar, the story continues to exert a strange fascination over those drawn to the darker corners of American history. Modern historians and amateur researchers make pilgrimages to the overgrown foundations that still mark the site of the manor house, searching through brambles and kudzu for artifacts that might shed new light on events that have been thoroughly mythologized by time and repetition. The site itself has become a palimpsest of American racial anxiety, with each generation adding its own interpretations and assumptions to the accumulated legend. During the Jim Crow era, Red Briar was cited as historical justification for segregation and disenfranchisement. During the Civil Rights Movement, it was alternately invoked as an example of justified resistance or dangerous precedent. In the modern era, it has become a touchstone for discussions about historical memory and the ways in which narratives of the past serve the political needs of the present. The academic consensus remains largely unchanged from Sheriff Crockett's original conclusions, treating Red Briar as a straightforward case of slave rebellion that escalated into mass violence and arson. University textbooks mention the incident briefly as an example of the tensions that eventually erupted into civil war, while local tourism boards have largely ignored the site due to its uncomfortable racial implications and remote location. Graduate students occasionally write papers about Red Briar, but their research is hampered by the scarcity of primary sources and the politically sensitive nature of the subject matter. The few scholars who have attempted to dig deeper into the historical record have found themselves discouraged by department chairs who prefer research topics that generate less controversy and attract more funding. But the discovery of Pritchard's folios in the archives of a defunct Methodist seminary has begun to attract attention from researchers willing to look beyond the official narrative. The circuit preacher's meticulous documentation reveals inconsistencies and alternative interpretations that suggest the true story of Red Briar may be far more complex than its legend suggests. His maps, interviews, and analysis provide a different perspective that challenges the assumptions underlying more than a century of historical interpretation. Contemporary true crime podcasters and amateur historians have begun to notice patterns that connect Red Briar to other incidents throughout the antebellum South, where enslaved populations demonstrated strategic thinking and coordination that challenges stereotypes about their capabilities and agency. The idea that the oppressed might use their oppressors' own systems and prejudices against them has found resonance in an era increasingly aware of how power structures can be subverted from within. Online forums dedicated to historical mysteries have spawned detailed discussions about The Red Briar Incident, with amateur researchers sharing theories and evidence that academic historians have overlooked or ignored. These discussions have revealed connections between Red Briar and other suspicious incidents throughout the region, suggesting that Isaiah's network may have been part of a larger pattern of resistance that extended far beyond any single plantation. If you're finding these connections as disturbing as I am, consider subscribing to support this kind of deep research into the stories that mainstream history prefers to keep buried. The overgrown ruins of Red Briar have become a site of informal pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how narrative and power intersect in the construction of historical memory. Visitors report an unsettling atmosphere that seems to persist despite the passage of time, as if the very ground retains some echo of the deception and violence that once played out above it. Metal detector enthusiasts have recovered artifacts from the site that complicate the official story, including pieces of expensive china that show no evidence of violence, wine bottles that appear to have been deliberately broken rather than shattered by fire, and metal objects that suggest the presence of sophisticated equipment that would have been unusual on a typical plantation. The truth about what happened on that November night in 1861 may never be fully recovered, but the questions it raises about justice, revenge, and the power to control one's own story remain as relevant today as they were when Isaiah first conceived his perfect plan for turning a master's weapon against itself. The Red Briar Incident stands as a reminder that history is written by the survivors, and that the most important stories are often the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. Standing in the ruins of Red Briar today, surrounded by the encroaching forest and the silence of abandoned dreams, one confronts uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice and the price of systematic oppression. The official record, carved in courthouse ledgers and newspaper archives, tells one story, a tale of savage rebellion that confirmed every prejudice about the dangers of slavery and the necessity of white control. But the whispers that survive in family memories and fading documents suggest something far more sophisticated and morally complex. A story of people who recognized that they were trapped in a system designed to destroy them, and who found a way to turn that system's own logic against itself with devastating effectiveness. The genius of what happened at Red Briar lies not in its violence, but in its strategic use of racist assumptions to achieve goals that would have been impossible through direct confrontation. Isaiah and his conspirators understood that their oppressors' greatest weakness was their inability to imagine enslaved people as capable of complex planning and moral reasoning. By allowing Silas Lament's plot to proceed while taking control of its aftermath, they achieved something unprecedented. They escaped slavery while ensuring that their masters would be remembered as the perpetrators of their own destruction. The fire that consumed the manor house burned more than wood and flesh. It consumed a version of history that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and resistance in antebellum America. In its place, it created a legend that served the needs of those who came after, providing a simple story of racial conflict that obscured the more complex realities of strategic thinking, moral agency, and the ways in which the oppressed can claim control over their own narratives. The most unsettling aspect of the Red Briar story is not its violence, but its demonstration that those who are written out of history are capable of rewriting it themselves when necessity demands it. The 40 souls who allegedly perpetrated the massacre may have been guilty of many things, but their greatest crime may have been their refusal to accept the roles that had been assigned to them in someone else's story. What burns forever in the ruins of Red Briar is not the memory of a single night of violence, but the recognition that the most powerful weapon against oppression may be the oppressor's own inability to see their victims as fully human agents capable of outsmarting them at their own game. The enslaved conspirators achieved something that generations of abolitionists had failed to accomplish. They destroyed slavery from within while ensuring that their oppressors would be remembered as the authors of their own destruction. The perfect revenge was not the killing of masters by slaves, but the transformation of masters into slaves to their own evil intentions, trapped in a web of their own weaving and destroyed by the very systems they had created to protect themselves. The fire at Red Briar burned away more than a plantation house. It burned away the illusion that power based on oppression could ever be truly secure. In the end, the question is not whether Isaiah and his conspirators were murderers or heroes, but whether they were human beings capable of moral reasoning and strategic thinking in the face of systematic dehumanization. The answer to that question challenges fundamental assumptions about race, power, and resistance that continue to shape American society more than a century and a half after the last flames died at Red Briar. Subscribe if you believe, as I do, that the most important stories are often the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past, and that the greatest act of resistance may be the refusal to accept the version of history written by the victors.